Cervantes and Copernicus, Castiglione, Bruegel, Erasmus and Vesalius, Renaissance men, the great thinkers of their time, Renaissance men, and that's the end of this rhyme.
Welcome back, young scholars. In this video, we'll be discussing the Renaissance and hopefully maintaining a certain level of modesty. Okay, so the big questions you should be able to answer are: first, why did the Renaissance start in Italy? And then second, what were the big ideas of the Renaissance and how were they expressed in art and literature? So first, the word Renaissance is a French word. It means rebirth. It's really the rebirth of classical Greek and Roman ideas. So go back again to the classical age from 600 BCE into 600 CE. And in Western Europe, again, we talked about the classical Greek city-states and then the Roman Empire. And so the Renaissance is a rebirth of those classical Greek and Roman ideas following the disorder and disunity of the Middle Ages. And there's a term for this: classicism. And so the classic narrative of European history is that, Europe had it going on in the classical age with the Greeks and the Romans, and then there was this 1,000-year period where things were bad, and it was known as the Dark Ages, although as we know, that's kind of an oversimplification. But then you have the rebirth, the Renaissance of those classical Greek and Roman ideas. Now, the problem with this argument is that it suggests by talking about a rebirth that at some point that those classical Greek and Roman ideas were somehow like dead, disappeared, when, as we know, many of those ideas just moved from Greece, from Rome, to places like the Arab world in period 3, or Constantinople in the Byzantine Empire, what was left of the Eastern Roman Empire. And eventually they're going to make their way back to Western Europe during period 4 and lead to this Renaissance or rebirth. And you can see this in art, for example, with sculptures like this one, the Venus de Milo, a classical Greek sculpture. Here we can see the Renaissance, David by Michelangelo. And so we can see again some similarities there in terms of realism, right? When you think about Greek art and Greek sculpture, the way in which they incorporated folds into the clothes of their subjects so that it looked like the subjects were actually moving, and again, make it as realistic as possible. You see it in the subject matter of art. So pieces like this, School of Athens by Raphael, has images of Aristotle and Plato and Socrates and Pythagoras. So the subject matter is oftentimes derived from either Greek or the Roman Empire. Architecture, very similar. We see domed architecture. Remember, we first were focusing on domed architecture in the Roman Empire, and also these columns here. So this is Renaissance architecture, but it's based again on classical Greek and Roman styles. The Renaissance begins in Italy, but Italy is not a country at this point. It's just a collection of city-states like Rome and Florence and Venice and Genoa. And it slowly kind of spreads north, eventually making its way to places like the Netherlands and northern France and England. And so we'll talk about some famous writers, for example, like Shakespeare, who was from England, that was part of a later northern Renaissance. So we can divide the Renaissance up into like the early Italian Renaissance and the later northern Renaissance. So why did the Renaissance start in the Italian city-states? Well, there were a number of reasons. First, Italian city-states had become wealthy through taxation, especially of Mediterranean sea trade. Cities like Florence and Venice became incredibly well off. In period 4, states were growing more effective at taxing. So they would establish systems like tax farming. What tax farming means is that instead of the state having to go out and appoint bureaucrats to engage in collecting taxes, because no one likes to pay their taxes, instead they would contract with private individuals to guarantee and give them the exclusive right to collect taxes within a certain region, and tax farmers would then get to keep a certain cut or percentage of the taxes that they collected. So they had some incentive to want to collect the taxes as vigorously as possible. So states grew very wealthy, like Venice, like Florence. This is an image showing the Duomo of Florence, the major cathedral that was built there. So with this more efficient tax collection, as states grew wealthier, they were able to build larger, more monumental and grand architecture like this particular cathedral in Florence. Now, a second reason why Italy was because in addition to the states growing wealthier, you had merchants growing wealthier. And in period 4, when merchants wanted to show off their wealth, they didn't have cars they could buy, but increasingly people were turning to art as a way of showing off their wealth. And this is known as patronage. So these wealthy Italian merchants would be patrons of the arts and architecture and even scholarship in some cases. So an example of this was the Medici family from Florence. They were supporting artists like Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci. A third reason why Italy was because of their location on the Mediterranean Sea. We said before the Roman Empire started in Italy partly because of its prime geographic spot there. But in period 4, they were connected to the places where classical Greek and Roman ideas had moved and spread to, like the Arab world over here, which is increasingly growing this way, like the Byzantines, what was left of the Byzantine Empire. So the Italians traded with the Byzantines, they traded with the Islamic states like the Ottomans, and they were the preservers of Greek and Roman ideas and culture. So how did the Renaissance transform art and literature in Western Europe? Well, first we have to know some of the important artists. And hopefully one of the things that you learned as a kid growing up are the names of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. So artists like Leonardo da Vinci and Donatello and Raphael and Michelangelo are all names that you should be aware of that are all associated with that Italian Renaissance. So if you can remember the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, you can remember 4 of the most important artists in the Italian Renaissance. So some particular characteristics of Renaissance art is first, the Renaissance artists are going to paint and sculpt people as realistically as possible. And so we call this realism. And we see it here with this particular piece, the Pieta by Michelangelo, featuring Mary and Jesus, again sculpted in very lifelike ways. Another way in which they created realism was through the use of perspective and three-dimensionality. Whenever you're painting, you want to try and recreate what the eye sees. And what the eye sees is a vanishing point off into the distance. And so all of the lines, in order to achieve three-dimensionality, are moving towards that vanishing point. So we can see it here in a piece like this, The Last Supper, where all of the lines on this particular piece are all focused on the focal point or the vanishing point, which is Jesus. You can see it in images like this one. Sometimes artists would play with the vanishing point. Here, the vanishing point is actually off the painting itself. It's over here. So artists use perspective to achieve realism, to achieve three-dimensionality. We're going to look at a few different pieces of art, and we're going to identify whether or not this piece of art is from the Renaissance or from the Middle Ages. Recall from an earlier video, Middle Age art was intentionally bad, right? The church had so much power in period 3 that they were demanding that artists didn't make their paintings, their art too beautiful because they worried that people would worship the image and not the ideals that the image represented. And so we're going to do a quick little test here. Is this Renaissance or Middle Age? This is Renaissance. You can see, again, the lines of perspective. You can see Roman architecture with the dome and the arches. So that's Renaissance. Here we see a good example of Middle Age art. So you can see a very flat, two-dimensional art, oftentimes of a religious subject, but disproportionate. Mary is intentionally painted in a way not to make her look overly beautiful. Here we see an example of Renaissance art. Again, three-dimensionality and sculpture, realistic looking, but at this particular time we're talking about a subject of the Greek god. Here we have an example of Middle Age art again, with Mary, Jesus sitting on her lap, but he looks like he's like 30 years old and about 2 feet tall. And then finally this, you'd think Renaissance. However, this is actually classical age. So sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between classical age art and Renaissance art because, again, the subject matters are very similar and the styles are very similar. In addition to art, the Renaissance is also known for its contribution to literature. And this really begins in 1455 with a German named Johannes Gutenberg who develops a movable metal type printing press. Now, when I was in high school, I had to memorize that Johannes Gutenberg was the person who invented the printing press. But in actuality, the printing press, as you recall from an earlier video, was invented in China, but that was a movable wooden type printing press. And it took essentially 500 years for that first printing press design to make it across the Silk Road over into Europe and eventually be elevated by Jonas Gutenberg, who turned it into a movable metal type printing press. Now, one of the things I always find very fascinating about the printing press is the way in which they kept and maintained letters on different shelves. And so for letters like these uppercase letters, they were kept in the upper cases, versus the lowercase letters were kept in the lower cases. And that's where those terms upper and lowercase come from. If you're going to make a copy of a book, let's say the Bible, and you only want to make one copy, which one is it faster to do? Is it faster to handwrite the Bible, or is it faster to put together the printed copy of a Bible? Well, stop and think about this. In a Bible, there are 1,286 individual pages. For each page, there are 2,500 pieces of individual typeface that have to be arranged in very neat, orderly rows. Then that equates to about 3,215,000 individual places that have to be put in order to create a book. And so, does anyone take a guess? That takes about 3 to 5 years is kind of the estimate. So if you were going to write one book, you'd probably be able to handwrite it faster. And you could probably maybe even handwrite 5 or even maybe 10 books faster than you can to arrange the letters in the printing press and print off books. But if you're going to copy and want to copy 1,000 books, the printing press is definitely the way to go. And the impact of this is we're going to see the number of books in Europe dramatically increase. And as a result, the effect is that we're going to see increased literacy rates. So more books means increased literacy. Increased literacy means the increased spread of ideas and knowledge throughout European society. And it leads to, again, like a feedback loop where increased literacy leads to more ideas leads to greater technology, which leads to even greater literacy and understanding. Some Renaissance writers that I want you to be aware of. First, one of my favorites, Machiavelli. Machiavelli is an Italian. He's going to write a book called The Prince. And why it's called The Prince is he's giving advice to would-be rulers who are princes. And this advice is how to gain and maintain power. And so he offers a number of different methods for doing this, most of which are pretty dirty. And what Machiavelli would though always say is the ends would justify the means. The ends which would be to achieve power can be justified using really any means possible. So whatever it takes in politics, even if it means playing dirty, you need to do it. So Machiavelli has a bit of a devious reputation in world history for that reason. Now, another Renaissance writer to be aware of in the Northern Renaissance is William Shakespeare. So William Shakespeare is going to use themes of classicism and humanism. We'll talk more about what that is in a second. But classicism, again, is he's going to set some of his plays in either classical Greece or the Roman Empire, probably the most famous being Julius Caesar. And humanism, a lot of his plays focus on human achievements. And the Renaissance was really focused on the here and now and celebrating human achievements. And this is distinguishable from a lot of the writing in period 3, which is more focused on not this life, but instead the afterlife. So there's this obsession with human beings and how they're sinners and how they're going to be going to hell or heaven. So there's a lot of focus on salvation in period 3. By the time we get to the Renaissance, they're just kind of over that. And instead, they want to celebrate the grandeur and majesty of the human life. And you see that in art like this, where we have an image of Mary and Jesus, but with like very faint halos. And so the purpose of this image is to focus more on Mary and Jesus as human beings and less on their divine nature. And so that's the concept of humanism. So in the Renaissance, we're talking about classicism, we're talking about humanism, we're talking about realism, all isms that are associated with the Renaissance that you should understand and be aware of. So the big questions you should be able to answer after watching this video are, again, why did the Renaissance start in Italy? And second, what were the big ideas of the Renaissance and how were they expressed in art and literature? Thanks for watching.